Hey everybody, so today I want to walk you through a research project that I worked on with a bunch of colleagues. It just got accepted at a journal called American Speech, and it's something that I think is genuinely cool, even if you don't really care about linguistics. Because what we did was to use AI to analyze 227 million tweets to answer some questions about how Black Americans actually use language. Questions that linguists have been arguing about for like 50 years. So buckle in. I'll try to make this make sense even if you've never taken a linguistics class in your life. I'm Dr. Taylor Jones, and this is Language Jones. This part of the video is sponsored by Speak. So I studied Mandarin in college. 4 years, got pretty decent, and then life happened and I basically didn't speak it for almost a decade. Recently, a close friend of mine moved to Taiwan, and I thought, okay, I have to brush up. So I've been using Speak, and here's the thing. In a few weeks, I've picked up more language that I can actually use than I did in years of college classes, because Speak isn't about drills and flashcards. It builds a custom learning path based on where you are and what you actually need, and then it gets you speaking out loud from day one. I could feel the challenge of producing what I wanted to say quickly and accurately, and I was learning content about Chinese food and vegetarian cuisine that I can actually immediately use, like 你们有什么推荐的菜吗? Rather than say the long explanations of why Chinese painting is culturally superior to Western oil painting in the textbook series we used that the CCP produced. There's also this free talk feature where you practice real conversations like ordering at a coffee shop, meeting someone new, and there's a whole community of people doing the same scenarios, which honestly makes it feel way less intimidating. The whole thing is hands-free, so I've been doing it on walks, making coffee, whenever. 10 minutes a day, and it actually sticks. If you want to try it, and they have French, German, Spanish, Korean, Japanese, and others too, start your free week with Speak using the link below. Okay, so quick context. There's a language variety called African American language. You might have heard of it called AAVE, African American Vernacular English, African American English, AAE, or Black English, or Ebonics back in the day. We're calling it AAL in this project after a lot of discussion. Some of you know that I'm currently co-authoring a descriptive grammar of Black English with Hiram Smith and DeAndre Esprit-Conaway, but Lisa Green, one of the co-authors and the author of the Cambridge Introduction to African American English, made a compelling argument for this particular paper. Regardless of what you call it, it is a real rule-governed variety of English spoken by many, though not all, Black Americans. It has its own grammar, its own sound patterns, its own vocabulary. By the way, if you're interested in getting updates on the descriptive grammar that I'm co-authoring, you can always leave an email at www.languagejones.com/AGOBE for a grammar of Black English. Now, here's where it gets interesting. For a long time, the prevailing idea in linguistics was that Black English was basically the same wherever you went. New York, Atlanta, Chicago, LA, same language. And it was supposedly spoken mostly by young working-class men in inner cities. Turns out that's not really true. And the reason linguists thought it was true is kind of embarrassing, honestly. Early studies on Black English had real problems. They mostly interviewed young men in cities. They were often conducted by white researchers who didn't speak the language. Sample sizes were tiny. They were conducted at the end of the Great Migration and didn't always take local social factors into account, like when Bill LeBove wrote in 1972 that the Black teenager in Harlem has no occasion to hear Caribbean speech, despite the 1970 census saying there were like over 300,000 Caribbeans in New York City. So you ended up with this distorted picture that got baked into the textbooks, and even worse, into how the general public thinks about Black speech, if they do at all. More recent work has chipped away at this uniformity myth, but it is slow going because traditional linguistics is labor intensive. You interview people, you transcribe tapes, you annotate features by hand. It takes forever, and you end up with maybe a few hundred speakers in one city. I was on the cutting edge of a new discipline, sometimes referred to as computational sociolinguistics. So I published a paper in American Speech in 2015 using text data from Twitter to demonstrate that there are meaningful dialect regions in Black English in the United States in terms of lexical items, words, and phonology. So the same word might be joint in New York, jawn in Philly, jaunt in DC, or nuttin' in New York and nuffin in DC. Now, these are probabilistic. The same speakers might use nothing, nuttin', and nuffin, even in the same sentence, as in some examples from the Philadelphia neighborhood corpus. But there's a strong geographical preference on the aggregate. For my dissertation, published in 2020, I asked people to read a short story aloud and used all sorts of phonetic and statistical tools to measure their accents, and found the same broad regional patterns held up in accents as well. But the question the first author on this paper, Tessa Massis, asked was, what if we could just look at everybody, or at least a representative chunk of everybody? That's where the tweets come in. We used a dataset called Twitter 4 years. It's 227 million tweets from across the entire US posted between 2011 and 2015. Every tweet had a GPS location attached, so we knew which neighborhood it came from. A few things to know about this. First, why that time period? Because back then, Twitter was disproportionately used by Black Americans. In 2012, like 28% of Black internet users were on Twitter versus 12% of white users. So this is actually a pretty good window for studying African American language specifically. Second, we filtered out celebrities, spam bots, and marketing accounts. We wanted regular people having regular conversations. Third, this dataset is 5 orders of magnitude bigger than previous social media studies of African American language. That's 100,000 times bigger. It's an absurd amount of data, an unreasonable, unwieldy amount of data. Now, social media isn't a perfect mirror of how people actually talk. Twitter users skew young and urban. People write differently than they speak. We're upfront about all of that. But the scale that you get from this kind of data lets you see patterns that are just invisible at smaller scales. And actually, I demonstrated in a paper in 2016 called Tweets as Graffiti what the reconstruction of vulgar Latin can tell us about Black Twitter. Leave me a comment if you want to know about that people actually do very often attempt to capture how they speak with non-standard spelling. So you can learn a lot from something like, he finding a mug, or I don't even be doing nothing. Okay, so here's the technical challenge. We picked 18 grammatical features to look for. Things like habitual be. I just be liking the beat. This isn't the same as I am liking the beat. It specifically means habitually over and over again, or a generic. Again, if you want to know more about this stuff, sign up for updates on the book. 0 copula. She the folk around here. Dropping the is. Finna. She finna have a baby, meaning about to. Resultant done. You done lost your mind. Negative concord. I ain't doing nothing wrong. What your English teacher would wrongly call a double negative. More on this in a minute. And about a dozen others. Now, finding these in a huge, messy data set is hard. You can't just keyword search be because regular be just shows up everywhere. You need something that understands grammatical context. So we trained an AI, specifically a language model called BERT, to recognize each feature. We hand-labeled a bunch of examples, fine-tuned BERT, and let it loose on all 227 million tweets. The cool thing about this approach is that it picks up variation it wasn't explicitly told about. Like for future gone, it correctly catches gone, 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 and gone, all the spelling variants that people actually use online. Then we mapped every tweet to its census tract. These are little geographic units, about 4,000 people each, and calculated how often each feature showed up in each tract. Here's where we did something that I think is genuinely new. There's an existing metric in the field called the dialect density measure, or DDM. It basically just counts what percentage of someone's sentences contain an African American language feature. Treats every feature equally. We thought we could do better. We used a technique called principal components analysis. Don't worry about the math. If you know, you know. But basically, it looks at which features tend to co-occur with each other. Features that show up together a lot get weighed more heavily as indicators of AAL. Features that show up by themselves or that show up in tracts that don't use other AAL features get weighted less. We call this metric the AALScore. And what's nice about it is it treats AAL as a system, features used together in a coherent way rather than just a checklist. Okay, the fun part. What did we find? Finding number 1, there is a clear geographic pattern and the heart of it is in the rural South. When we mapped AALScore across the country, the highest scores lit up across Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, the home, and specifically the rural parts of those states. Not Atlanta, not Charlotte, the countryside. This is kind of a big deal because most of the academic literature on AAL focuses on cities: New York, Detroit, Philadelphia, DC. There's this whole story about the Great Migration where 6 million Black Americans moved out of the South into northern cities between 1915 or so and 1970, and that's supposedly where modern AAL crystallized. But our data says, hold on, the rural South is still a major center for AAL today. Maybe even the major center. Now, a caveat's in order. We drew on a lot of the existing literature and we worked directly with Lisa Green, who quite literally wrote the book on African American English, or at least one of them. She's from Louisiana originally. We've discussed this ad nauseum, but the features that we chose, to my ear sitting here in Harlem, sound a little Southern. They're all considered characteristic of African American language in the academic literature, and they all very much do occur here as well. And yes, we controlled for things like double negatives and resultative done and finna that are shared with Southern white vernacular English, but still found a strong influence in the South, also controlling for differences in black population. But it's possible that another set of features might find a slightly different geographic balance. All of that said, the majority of the black population of the US is still in the South. They're not necessarily in the rural South, so this is a genuinely interesting finding. Finding number 2, there's no uniform AAL. There's regional variation. I could have told you that. We found different features clustering in different regions. Habitual B is the top feature in the Metro, Northeast, and Midwest, but it's less dominant in the South, where ain't takes over. This is actually a really nice validation of claims made variously by John Rickford, Bill LeBove, and Guy Bailey, among others, about the origin, development, and trajectory of habitual B, including claims that it is on the rise in northern cities and that it developed more in the 20th century, as opposed to being a holdover from the 1800s or earlier. Resultant done is way more common in the rural South than anywhere else. So speakers in Detroit and Mississippi are both speaking AAL, and as I demonstrated in my dissertation, they're doing so with largely the same accent due to migration patterns, but they're using different parts of the lexical and grammatical toolkit. This directly contradicts that old uniformity myth. Finding number 3, and this one really surprised us, Mexican-American communities use a lot of AAL features, or at least seem to. Going in, we expected Puerto Rican communities to have the strongest connection to AAL. There's a long literature on Puerto Rican English in places like New York and Philadelphia using AAL features. Mexican-American communities? Less studied, and the existing literature suggested looser connections. But the data went the other way. When you control for how many black residents are in an area, areas with higher Mexican populations show more AAL usage, and the effect is actually stronger than for Puerto Rican populations. We can't tell from this data alone whether that's Mexican Americans themselves using AAL features or whether it's black Americans who live near Mexican communities using AAL more. Both are interesting. If it's the first, it means there's a lot more AAL happening in Mexican American communities than the literature recognizes, possibly tied to identity construction, expressing a non-white identity, covert prestige of Black English, things like that. If it's the second, it suggests something interesting about language contact, that being around speakers of other non-English languages might mean less pressure to conform to mainstream English norms, or more desire to assert Black identity, capital B. This is not unheard of. Gerard Van Herk has a fantastic squib, a fancy term for a short paper, that demonstrates with some intelligent statistical analysis that we can't rule out the Great Migration as a trigger for the shift in northern white accents called the Northern Cities Vowel Shift. Think the Bears, or anything from The Bear. Van Herk's paper was Fear of a Black Phonology. So why should you care about any of this? A few reasons. One, it pushes back against stereotypes. The idea that AAL is uniform, or that it's just bad English, or that it belongs to one type of speaker, all of that gets harder to defend when you can show with 227 million data points that AAL is actually this rich, varied, geographically patterned linguistic system. Two, it highlights communities that academic linguistics has basically ignored. The rural South, Mexican American communities. These are huge populations of AAL speakers, and they barely show up in the existing literature. Three, and this is the methodological piece, it shows that you can use AI tools to study marginalized language varieties at a scale that just was not possible before. There are tons of languages and dialects around the world that have the same problem AAL did. Small sample sizes, biased data collection, researchers who don't really speak the language. The approach that we used, intelligently using machine learning while asking questions framed by experts across disciplines and validated by speakers of the language itself, could work for any of them. One last nerdy thing and then I'll wrap up. There's a long-running debate in linguistics about whether African American language has core features that every AAL speaker uses that define the language. Our data suggests the answer is probably not a clean yes or no. It looks more like a continuum. Some features, ain't, habitual be, future gon, negative concord, are very widely shared. Others, be done, steady, personal dative, are more restricted to specific regions or social groups. There isn't a clean line between core and not core. It's a gradient. And that's consistent with what I found in other research. For instance, that be done construction, younger Black Philadelphians just don't use it anymore, despite it being everywhere in the Philadelphia neighborhood corpus. Recordings that were made in the 1980s. All right, that's the project. If you want all the technical details, the paper is coming out in American Speech. Links in the description when it's officially out. If you want to know more about linguistics, I am launching a digital course later this year, and you can sign up for the waitlist and more at www.languagejones.com/blueprint. Big thanks to my co-authors and the anonymous reviewers who made the paper a lot better. And thank you for watching. If this kind of thing interests you, hit subscribe, and I will see you next time. Happy learning.